Today I turned 65. To be honest, the day felt strange, as if it wasn't entirely real. Maybe it's my age or perhaps something else. I sat in my living room, surrounded by loved ones. My children, grandchildren, and my wife. Everything seemed perfect. The festive table filled with the best dishes, laughter, clinking glasses, and heartfelt toasts for my health and happiness. My eldest son, David, as usual, stood to give a speech. He began talking about our shared memories, recalling moments from his childhood, family trips, and holidays together. He spoke of how quickly the years had passed and how proud he was of me. I smiled, feeling warmth and fulfillment from seeing my family gathered, happy, and healthy. But as David continued his speech, something pulled my attention away. From the corner of my eye, I noticed movement. The hallway door, leading to the front of the apartment, was slightly open. That wasn't unusual. Guests had come and gone all evening, and someone must have forgotten to close it properly. But there, in the doorway, stood something. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or my tired eyes playing games. But no, I could see it more clearly now. A figure, tall and still, half hidden in the shadow of the dimly lit hallway. It was a man. The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching us. A cold chill ran down my spine, but I didn't want to alarm anyone. I glanced around the room. No one else seemed to notice. My wife, sitting next to me, was smiling at David's speech. My grandchildren were too busy giggling amongst themselves. I blinked and looked back at the door. The figure was still there. My heart began to race. It wasn't just the stillness of the figure that unsettled me. It was the eerie sense of familiarity. His face, though difficult to see fully in the shadows, the more I stared, the more certain I became. I knew this man, but it was impossible. Couldn't be. The man in the doorway had been dead for over 20 years. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, convincing myself it was a trick of my imagination. Maybe I was just overwhelmed by the evening, or maybe the dim light was playing tricks on my eyes. But no matter how hard I tried to explain it away, the figure remained, solid, unmoving. It was Jack, my childhood friend. He had died 2 decades ago in a tragic car accident. We had been close, like brothers, but I hadn't thought of him in years. Yet there he was, standing in my hallway, his gaunt face pale and hollow, his eyes devoid of life. I felt an intense cold creeping through the room, like the air itself had turned icy. My breathing grew shallow, my chest tightening with a sense of impending dread. "David, can you close the door, please?" He stopped mid-sentence, surprised by my sudden request, but nodded and started walking toward the hallway. My heart pounded as I watched him approach the door. David nodded and walked toward the hallway, oblivious to the figure standing there. My eyes never left the man. Jack, my long-dead friend, frozen in the doorway, his empty eyes locked on me. As David approached, my breath caught in my throat. David walked straight through him. He passed through Jack as though he were nothing more than mist. The chill in the room intensified. I could see David shiver slightly as he returned to the table, but he didn't say anything. No one did. No one had seen what I saw. I glanced around, my heart still pounding in my chest. My wife was rubbing her arms, trying to warm herself, and my grandchildren were pulling blankets over their laps. A few people murmured about the sudden cold. "Must be the draft from the hallway," my wife said, her voice calm, unaware of the true source of the chill. The others nodded in agreement, brushing it off as a simple breeze from the door. But I knew better. When I looked back toward the door, Jack was no longer standing there. My stomach dropped, my pulse quickening again as I scanned the room. And then I saw him. He was standing at the far end of the room now, near the window, his pale, lifeless eyes still fixed on me. No one else seemed to notice him. No one turned their head, no one gasped in horror as I had. It was as if I was the only one who could see him. The coldness in the room grew deeper, sharper, wrapping around me like invisible hands. I felt paralyzed, my mind racing. Why was he here? Why now, after all these years? Jack's face remained unchanged, expressionless, hollow. I could barely remember what he looked like when he was alive. Now, all I could see was this ghostly version of him, devoid of any warmth or humanity. Should I say something? Tell everyone what I was seeing? But what if it was just me? What if this was some trick of my mind, a hallucination brought on by stress or exhaustion? No, it felt too real, too cold, too present. His steps were silent, but his figure glided across the room with an eerie grace. He moved closer, weaving between the chairs and my unsuspecting family, all laughing, chatting, completely unaware of the specter among them. And then he stopped, just a few feet away from me, his dead eyes staring into mine. Couldn't breathe. It felt like the room was shrinking, the walls pressing in, the air thick with a suffocating weight. The laughter of my family faded into the background, their voices distant and muffled, as if they were in another world. Jack opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, a low, guttural whisper filled my ears, though his lips didn't move. "You left me," the voice said, faint and hollow, echoing inside my head. A chill ran down my spine, colder than the draft, colder than the ghostly presence in front of me. I tried to say, but my voice cracked, barely a whisper. But Jack only stared, his eyes unblinking, his mouth still open, as if he was silently screaming at me from some dark, forgotten place. Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. The room felt even colder now, and my breath came out in short, foggy puffs. I wasn't imagining this. Something was happening, something real. Before I could react, Jack moved again. This time, he was right beside me, standing over my shoulder, his icy breath grazing my neck. And then, in the same ghostly voice, I heard him whisper again, this time clearer, more menacing. "I'm not done with you." The air around me felt like ice, thick and oppressive. His eyes, empty and black as voids, bore into me with a malevolence I had never felt before. My heart pounded wildly, the blood rushing in my ears, drowning out the sounds of the party, the laughter of my family. I could feel the weight of his stare like a leaden hand on my chest. "You've had your time," Jack's voice hissed, the words slithering into my ears like a cold wind. His mouth still didn't move, but the voice was unmistakable. It was everywhere, in the room, in my head, vibrating in my bones. "You've lived your life," he whispered again. "Now it's my turn." He was here to take my life. No, it's not my time. But the voice persisted, more forceful, like a rising storm. "You've lived long enough, more than enough. 65 years is a full life. But mine was cut short. Do you remember?" I swallowed hard, a surge of guilt washing over me. I did remember. Jack and I had been inseparable once, best friends from childhood. But after his accident, I hadn't visited his grave. I hadn't kept my promise to look after his family. I had moved on, as if his memory had been buried with him. And now he was back, seeking something I had never imagined. Jack leaned closer, his cold breath freezing the air around me. "Today is your last day," he whispered. "I've come to take what's mine, your life." Panic surged through me, my mind racing for a way out, but I was trapped, paralyzed by his presence. The room felt smaller, darker, as if the walls were closing in. My family, still talking and laughing, seemed distant, like a scene from a different world, completely unaware of the nightmare unfolding in front of me. I glanced at David, who was pouring wine into glasses, oblivious to the terror gripping his father. My wife smiled as she passed a plate of food to one of the grandchildren, completely unaware of the ghost standing just inches from me. The world carried on as if nothing had changed, but for me, everything was about to end. Jack's voice became colder, more sinister. You don't have a choice. This is your last night, your last breath. I've waited long enough. My heart hammered in my chest, every beat a desperate plea for more time. Why now? I managed to choke out. Why tonight? His hollow eyes gleamed with something like anger, or perhaps it was hunger. Because tonight is the night you cross over. 65 years. That's long enough, don't you think? I shook my head, desperate. I'm not ready. I need more time. Please. But Jack was unmoved. You've had your time. I've come to collect what's owed. You lived your life. I didn't get that chance. Now it's your turn to go. The weight of his words settled on me like a crushing burden. This wasn't just a ghost haunting me. Jack had come to take my place. He wanted my life because he believed it had been taken from him too soon. You can't, I began, but the words caught in my throat as Jack reached out a hand. I could feel the cold radiating from his pale skin, and though he never touched me, it felt as though something deep inside me shifted, like my soul itself had been disturbed. Every muscle in my body locked in place as Jack's hand hovered just inches from my chest. I gave you 20 extra years, he rasped, his voice now barely a whisper. 20 years of life I never got. Now, I've come for what's mine. The lights flickered again, casting long shadows across the room, and I felt something strange in the air. A pull, a tug deep within me, as if Jack was already starting to claim my very essence. No, I gasped, panic clawing at my throat. Not tonight. I'm not ready to go. But Jack's face was impassive, devoid of any mercy or compassion. We never get to choose, he whispered coldly. You're done, Michael. It's over. My entire body tensed as he spoke my name, like the final toll of a bell. I could feel it now, the icy grip tightening around my heart, my lungs squeezing the life from me. My vision blurred, and I felt lightheaded, as though my strength was being drained away with each passing second. The room spun around me, and the voices of my family became distant echoes, fading into the background like the final moments of a dream before waking. But I wasn't waking. This was no dream. This was real, and Jack was here to take everything from me. Please. But Jack only smiled, a twisted, hollow smile that chilled me to the core. It's time, Michael, he said, his voice cold and final. I began to lose consciousness. My vision blurred, the room spinning into a haze of shadows and cold. I could hear my family's voices, but they seemed distant, muffled, like I was underwater. I tried to speak, to tell them what was happening, but my lips wouldn't move. My body was numb, frozen, like I had been submerged in ice. Then suddenly there was a commotion. I felt hands on my shoulders, shaking me, heard voices rising in panic. Dad, Dad, can you hear me? It was David, his voice sharp with fear. I blinked slowly, barely able to keep my eyes open. I could see the concern on their faces now, my wife's trembling hands as she tried to lift my head, my grandchildren standing wide-eyed, unsure of what to do. It's so cold, someone muttered. I could hear the quiver in their voice. Why is it so cold in here? It wasn't just me. The room had become unnaturally frigid. I saw my breath in the air, misty and thick, as though the temperature had dropped far below freezing. My family, too, began to shiver. My wife wrapped a blanket around me, but it didn't help. The cold was too intense, too unnatural. One of the children screamed, pointing toward the aquarium in the corner of the room. I forced my eyes to follow their gaze, though my head felt heavy and my body weak. What I saw sent a fresh wave of horror through me. The fish, the beautiful, colorful fish I'd cared for over the years, were frozen solid. Their bodies were suspended in the ice, rigid and unmoving, like tiny statues trapped in glass. The water had turned to solid ice, as though the room had been transformed into a walk-in freezer. "Call an ambulance!" someone shouted. I could barely make out who, but I felt the urgency in the room. Everything was slipping away. I knew he was still there, watching, waiting, but my family couldn't see him. They couldn't understand what was happening. I tried to fight it, to stay awake, but the darkness was too strong. My eyelids grew heavier, my body sinking into the chair as the icy grip around me tightened. I was slipping away, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed, the steady beeping of machines surrounding me. The harsh, sterile light of the room stung my eyes, and my body felt weak, like I had been drained of all energy. My chest ached, and I could hear the rhythmic hum of a heart monitor nearby. I blinked, slowly adjusting to the light, trying to piece together where I was. My family was there, surrounding the bed, their faces etched with relief and exhaustion. My wife sat beside me, holding my hand, her eyes red from crying. "Michael," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're okay. You're going to be okay." I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, and the words wouldn't come out. Instead, I gave a weak nod, still trying to understand how I had ended up here. David leaned closer. "You collapsed," he said softly, his voice shaky. "We didn't know what was happening. You just went pale and cold. We couldn't wake you up. It was like the whole room, like everything froze." He glanced at the others, then back at me, uncertainty in his eyes. They said it was some kind of hypothermia, but it didn't make sense. It wasn't that cold. Not outside. And the fish, Dad, they froze solid. He had come for me. He had wanted to take me. But somehow I had been saved, pulled back from the edge. I could still feel the chill in my bones, the lingering sense that Jack wasn't done with me yet. But for now I was alive. For now, lying in the hospital bed, the chill from that night still clinging to my bones, I replayed everything over and over in my mind. Jack had come for me, of that I was certain. He had nearly succeeded. But how had I survived? How had I escaped the grip of death when it seemed inevitable? It wasn't until days later, as I lay in the quiet sterility of the hospital room, that fragments of memory began to return. At first, they came in flashes, like images glimpsed through a fog. But slowly, the pieces came together. I remembered the darkness surrounding me, the crushing cold, and Jack's hollow voice echoing in my mind. "It's time, Michael. You're done." In that moment, I had felt an overwhelming sense of finality. His icy grip on my soul had been almost complete. But then, something changed. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, a warmth, small but growing, spreading through the cold. It had grasped my hand, firmly but gently, pulling me back from the brink. I couldn't see who it was, but I felt a presence. Someone, something, shielding me from Jack's grasp. And then I heard a voice. Not Jack's harsh, cold whisper, but the soft, calming voice of my wife, Sarah. "You're not done," she had whispered in my ear. "You can fight this. You can come back." At first, I thought it had been a hallucination, something my fading mind had conjured in my final moments. But now, lying in the hospital bed, I knew it had been real. Sarah's voice, her presence, had reached me, even as I teetered on the edge between life and death. Somehow, through her love, she had pulled me back. But that wasn't all. I remembered more now. Something strange, something beyond explanation. As Sarah's voice called me back, something had happened in the room. It was as if the warmth of her love had created a barrier, pushing back the cold. The light had flickered once, and I saw Jack's face twist in frustration, his grip loosening, as though he couldn't hold on to me anymore. And then, in the final moments before everything went black, I saw something else. A second figure. It was barely visible, almost a shadow in the corner of my vision, but I could feel it there. It wasn't like Jack. This presence was gentle, calm. I couldn't make out a face, but I felt an overwhelming sense of peace emanating from it. The figure reached out, standing between me and Jack, blocking him from taking my life. This being, whoever or whatever it was, had come to protect me, to save me, and it had succeeded. The last thing I remembered before slipping into unconsciousness was Jack's furious scream, a sound that echoed in my mind as he was forced back into the shadows. He was powerless now, unable to claim what he had come for. In the hospital, I told Sarah everything. At first, she was silent, listening carefully, her face pale as I recounted the night. But when I finished, she simply squeezed my hand, her eyes brimming with tears. "I never stopped talking to you," she whispered. "When you collapsed, when you were cold as ice." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. Maybe that's why you survived." I nodded slowly, knowing it was more than just her voice. Somehow, Sarah's love, her connection to me, had created a force strong enough to drive Jack away. But there was also the shadowy figure, the protector. Who or what had it been? I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was something from the afterlife sent to intervene. Or maybe it was a manifestation of my own will to live, a part of me that wasn't ready to let go. Weeks passed, and I gradually regained my strength. But the memory of that night never left me. I knew Jack had been real, not just a hallucination or some fevered dream. He had come for me, and he would likely come again. But I also knew that I had something stronger than his cold grip on death. Love, the warmth of those who cared for me, and something more, a mysterious force that had stood between me and the abyss, granting me more time. For now, I had survived. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Jack wasn't done with me yet. There would be more to come.